In today's world, people feel lost in a sea of ideas. Which ones should we accept? Stay tuned because you're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. Here is your host, Kurt Jarris.
Well, thank you for joining us on this third episode of Veracity Hill. I'm glad that you're listening, and I hope that this show can be edifying to you and beneficial to you. I hope that you can gain something from it. This week, we've got a special guest who will be joining us here shortly, Dr. Corey Latta. And I'm really excited to be speaking with him about cultural horizons, the future of apologetics. Dr. Latta teaches and writes on theology, apologetics, and literature. He holds master's degrees in New Testament studies and English, as well as a PhD in literature. And before we start chatting with him, though, I wanted to tell you about a cool opportunity to be had next week at Christ Church of Oak Brook, the Defenders Media Conference. It's going to be a really fun time. The theme is Love God with Your Mind. It's Friday night and Saturday. So Friday it's 7 to 9:30, and Saturday it's 8:30 to 2:30. And we've got free Chick-fil-A, so we're really thankful for their sponsorship. It's going to be a fun time, and many people have signed up already. And it's just going to be a blast. We've got Ed Stetzer coming, Dr. Mike Lacona, and Tim McGrew. He's a big name in the apologetics world, and I'll be speaking, and Dr. Latta as well will be coming up from Memphis to join us. But first, let me play the promotional video clip that we did, and of course, you'll just hear the audio. But this is something that Defenders released a couple weeks ago.
We now live in a society where Christian belief is seen as bigoted, ignorant, and even immoral. How should we respond to these attacks? Join Defenders Media on August 5th and 6th to cultivate intellectual disciplines that deepen our faith, learn how to respond to skeptics, and discover how to winsomely share the gospel with non-believers. Love God with Your Mind at the Defenders Conference features highly respected Christian voices and thinkers, such as Ed Stetzer, Mike Lacona, Tim McGrew, and Kurt Jarris.
So there you have it. If you'd like more information, including to register if you're within, a couple hours drive of Chicagoland, you can go to defendersmedia.com and click on the web banner there at the top of the website. So, all right. So we're going to get to our discussion today with Dr. Corey Latta. Dr. Latta, are you there?
I am. How's it going?
Great. Hey, thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Happy to be here.
Great. Now, so you've got a PhD in literature, and so, of course, you must be a bibliophile of some sort. You've got a couple published works right now. Tell us about what you've got written, and then you've got some forthcoming stuff as well.
Yeah, I started writing in the area of New Testament. So my first book was a look at the doctrine of election in the book of Romans, and I looked at it in light of the Claudian Edict, which was Emperor Claudius's edict to expel the Jews from Rome in 49 AD. I did that. I changed directions professionally and started looking at the intersections of theology and literature. So my second work was called Functioning Fantasies, and it was just a bit of a survey of Tolkien's Hobbit and Lewis's Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe, looking at ideology, theology, and sort of the social function of those fantasies, some of the themes that run throughout both those works. My next work was a little more focused. I looked at C.S. Lewis's Theology of Time. So I compared it with theologies of time in T.S. Eliot, a very prominent 20th century Christian poet most people know, and then maybe a poet people don't know as well, W.H. Auden, also a Christian. Really interesting. They all converted to Christianity around 10 years, more or less, of each other. And pretty soon after converting, they all took up the topic of time. Now, there was no, collaboration. They just individually found time interesting. And I found that what they said about time was very synonymous. So I thought to kind of bridge those ideas together by looking at a French philosopher named Henri Bergson, who's views of time, greatly influenced 20th century philosophy. And so that one was called When the Eternal Can Be Met. I've got a forthcoming book on C.S. Lewis and writing.
Okay.
And it is his look. It's his. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, tell us. I'm curious about that. Lewis's writing. Just is it very practical, helping people to become better writers ourselves?
Yeah, that was a driving force for me to write it. So, out of all the works on Lewis out there, and there are many, there are only a few relationship to writing as a craft, and of those few, none really have the actual writer in mind. So I wanted to write a book that was really for the writer, kind of the writer's writing book. So I just spent a lot of time combing through Lewis's works and Lewis's letters, find anything I could that patched together this picture of his relationship to writing, just as a writer, but also his advice on writing. So the book is structured really in two major sections. One is his relationship to reading, because for Lewis, there was no craft of writing without the art of reading. And then I kind of start over again chronologically through his life and start going through his experience, which begins extremely early. The guy was writing stuff when he was 5 years old. So that was a fun book to write, and really has if you're a Lewis lover, I think you'll like it. If you are a would-be writer, I think you'll like it. And if you're any combination of the two, I think you'll like it. Yeah,
great. And then, it sounds like you've had, Lewis has been a big influence in your life, and I guess you'd mentioned Tolkien as well. Tell us how these guys and perhaps some other people have been influential for you.
Yeah, Lewis is, as George MacDonald was to Lewis, I think Lewis is to me. He's my father in the faith, for sure. I was raised a Christian and always had a lot of exposure to the Bible and evangelical theology, and understood the faith from a biblical standpoint, but never understood the faith from a philosophical, maybe a literary standpoint. I encountered Lewis first in college. I think I was a junior, maybe in college, and the first book I read was Mere Christianity.
Okay.
Like thousands and thousands of others, Mere Christianity just captured my heart. And I began to, it was very providential. The guy who owned the bookstore in my little Christian college, I was doing biblical studies as an undergraduate. This guy was obsessed with Tolkien and Lewis. He was a history teacher, but he was absolutely obsessed with these guys. So he just, personally stocked his own bookstore full of their works. I mean, you had collections from Lewis and Tolkien that you just couldn't find anywhere else. So every time I went to the bookstore, I would pick up a new volume. And by the time I was a senior, I was thoroughly just taken with Lewis and Tolkien. I had a class on Tolkien my senior year, and it was those guys that bridged my reason and my imagination. What had been built up through life rationally, just through the taking in of information of Scripture, that foundation all of a sudden had this grand building of imagination on it, which satisfied a deep personal part of me that hadn't yet been satisfied. So I always had an amateurish love of those guys. It wasn't until I decided to major in English as a second master's, and I really only did that master's just for personal gain. I wasn't professionally thinking about going into literary studies or anything like that, but it wasn't until I started in that master's and started looking at Tolkien and Lewis as literary critics and as ways to read literature that I really started to, kind of milk them for all they had. My love affair with Tolkien and Lewis goes back a ways, and though since I've been exposed to so many other authors and so many other works and systems of thought and things like that, I still go back to Lewis more than I go back to anyone else. Not only as the formative agent for my own thinking, but as a kind of a prescriptive guide to how to approach other topics. So I'll read literature oftentimes through the lens of Lewis's criticism, or think about theology part of my thinking about theology would be Lewis's way of thinking about theology. I find him a bottomless well. There's just so much to drink from there.
Yeah, no, that's great. Wow. For those of you listening, if you have a question for Dr. Latta, you've got a comment, or perhaps a question for myself, you can give us a call. The number is 505-2STRIVE. That's 505-278-7483. So, Corey, then, if you could tell us there, you'd mentioned a little bit about how you sort of took in these rational arguments, sort of the science of apologetics, if you will. But you noticed something with Lewis, sort of, he wasn't just a textbook, right? He wasn't just, here are the arguments, premise 1, premise 2, conclusion. He did something else in sort of applying that. Could you tell us a little bit about what that's like, making that transition?
Yeah. Lewis himself wasn't a biblical scholar, and he's always very shy, you could say, in the prefaces of many of his works. Like Great Divorce, he does this. Like he does this in Mere Christianity, he does it in Problem of Pain. He'll be quick to say, look, I'm not a theologian. These are just my thoughts on this topic. Or in Great Divorce, look, this is not a work of theology, this is a work of fiction and whatnot. So he's not a biblical scholar, but he has a way of looking at biblical text that I don't think anyone in history has ever been able to do. So, Matthew 6:33 is very well known. Seek first the kingdom of God, all other things will be given unto you. Well, Lewis puts that in his chapter on hope in Mere Christianity as aim at heaven and you'll get earth thrown in. Aim at earth and you'll get neither. Just the poetry and the ability to restate, and this is what, everyone agrees on with Lewis, is that he's got the ability to put into vernacular theological proposition. Just his ability to process biblical truth, theological ideas in poetic, beautiful, imaginative language has been really refreshing, really personally refreshing for me. And I don't think that I've ever come across a thinker who's been able to do that quite like Lewis. So there was in me, it's very subjective, I suppose, who we're influenced by, but there was in me a need for the imagination and a need for some sort of partner to the reasonable side of Christianity, or the rational approach to Christianity. I needed something a little more robust, I think. My mind was fully satisfied, but my heart oftentimes was not quite as full. Lewis comes at the faith so personally, so subjectively. I mean, if you just read his Surprised by Joy, or notice the way he deploys first person in many of his works. Of course, he really did think himself through the faith, but not without the aid of the Spirit, not without the role of the heart. By the time he gets to a theological conclusion, it is fully satisfied intellectually, but it is absolutely personalized for him. I mean, it really means something to him. There's a genuineness in his works. And I think I just encountered him at a time when I needed that most. I'd read Schaeffer around that time in college. I was thoroughly familiar with people like Packer and Grudem and these other theologians, but they just have something lacking.
They couldn't do it the same.
To Lewis.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
And obviously that comes from Lewis's, I think it comes from his literary background and his ability to create narrative, to craft, to think imaginatively. That's something that was sorely lacking in theology when he came along, and honestly, I think it's lacking still. I think we still need this.
Careful now, I'm a budding theologian myself, so.
yeah.
No, but I totally see what you're getting at here. It seems that perhaps you'd agree with me here, that Lewis is more inspiring than some of those other names that you had mentioned.
I think that's a good way to put it. You cannot help but read Screwtape or Miracles or The Great Divorce, which is my favorite of his, and not feel changed. I can't say that, though it's a great work. I can't say that about maybe Grudem's Systematic or something like that.
Right.
There is just a very personal and, to use your word, inspirational affect that Lewis brings about upon reading him. It's wonderful.
Yeah. Wow, that's something. So now, for those of you who are unfamiliar, with some of these terms here that we're dealing with, today we're talking about cultural horizons, the future of apologetics. And apologetics is, broadly speaking, the defense of the Christian worldview. And as Corey here has pointed out, it's not sometimes only a subcategory of theology. It plays itself out in society. It plays itself out in our writings, in our filmmaking, in our political realms, in the halls of power, both federally, right, and locally. Apologetics applies everywhere into everything. And so Lewis was very much a literary apologist. But today we're looking even more broader at that than just the literary, right? There's the cultural. So, Dr. Latta, perhaps you could tell us, what sort of things do you view as being part of this cultural apologetics category?
Yeah, I think it's really needed, and I think there's a lot more people today paying attention to this than really any time in history. Maybe there's some great people down at Houston Baptist who are doing a lot of work in this area. And we need more to join in. So the idea of cultural apologetics is looking at cultural mediums, music, art, film, literature, architecture. I mean, you can go on and on. Looking at these cultural mediums and drawing from them truth, keeping in mind, Justin Martyr's adage that all truth is God's truth. Drawing from them truth that bridges back to the gospel, that points to the gospel. So. There's so many examples of this. One example that comes to mind that I taught a redemptive cinema class recently, and this was a fun movie to watch, is we watched, Chris Nolan's Interstellar. Exquisite movie. I mean, just really well done, I think. It's a thoroughly closed movie. It seems like he's going to point to there being some sort of supernatural being in the movie, and if you've seen it, you know that he kind of closes that loop at the end. In the end, it's highly evolved humanity that becomes the othered presence in the universe. But there's a moment in the movie where Anne Hathaway's character is talking about love, her and Matthew McConaughey, and they're trying to decide which planet they're going to explore to see if it's habitable and all that. And they're talking about the value of love in grave decision making. And Matthew McConaughey is kind of dismissing love as any sort of absolute value that's not culturally constructed. And Anne Hathaway has this great line where she says, "We love those who have died. What's the social utility in that?" And Matthew McConaughey's answer is, well, there is none. And her point is that there are some things not socially constructed. There's some things that just are, that are eternal even. And love being one of those things. Now, if you're a Christian, I mean, I pause the movie on that moment. Okay, what did she just say? What's the implications of this? If you're a Christian, you have to sort of say, aha, there it is. There's the idea, the truth, that there are bits of our humanity that, while influenced by culture, don't originate in culture and only have explainable origins in some sort of being beyond cultural and social constructs. That's the starting point for cultural apologetics. Now, obviously, the point of termination where we want to end is the revelation of Christ and conversion to Christ. But you have to start, for many people who aren't going to be flipping through the pages of the Bible, right? You're going to have to start with what they're exposed to. What they're exposed to is, Mumford & Sons or a Chris Nolan movie or, a painting or something like that.
Yeah. Wow, that's quite deep. Really gets one thinking about how we ought to be perceiving and analyzing culture and the films that we see and such. When I was a child, Harry Potter was evil. How could you expose your children to witchcraft and sorcery? And the best films out there were Kirk Cameron type things. It seems it seems that within the subculture of Christian evangelicalism, there's this attempt at an alternative culture, a subculture, and my perception of it is that it's just not as good, right? The music is not done as well. The films are not done as well. The fiction is not done as well. Why is it? Is it because we've failed to make these key cultural observations?
Yeah, honestly, I mean, this is a touchy subject for many Christian artists because they get offended by this. But I do think that many Christian works of art are subpar. And I think because the content is privileged over the craft, the message is promoted or thought more about than the medium. And when you're talking about a work of art, the medium is the message. The craft is not just the means, it's the end. So to write an exquisite novel, a truly great novel, something like, The Sun Also Rises by Hemingway or something like that, you can't just think about, okay, how can I get this message I have to the people? How can I propagandize, my readers with this idea? It's about painstaking attention paid to the minutia of the medium itself. I mean, that scene has to be perfectly done. That dialogue has to ring true. So I think many Christian artists just think about, okay, how can I get this message out? Without thinking about, well, just how sharp is this conduit, right? How brilliant is this painting? How much time and devotion have I given to my development of the craft before I think about just, pushing a message through it? I so appreciate what Christians try to do with their films and try to do with music. I think we need it desperately. In an increasingly secularized world, we have to have that. I mean, anything we can get in some way helps, I think. But, if you read Tolstoy, you see someone devoutly committed to the things of the faith. But you don't see that ever replace his commitment to the craft of writing. Or you don't ever see that impinge on the integrity of the novel as a genre. I think Christians are called to work that points to the Creator, that smacks of excellence. I think we get in trouble when we forget that. So I think, keep presenting the gospel the ways you're equipped to do it, but make sure that you don't short your craft and you don't skip out on the call to excellence in so doing. I'm a poet, and I love writing poetry. I have tried many times to write Christian poetry. I cannot do it. When I say Christian, I mean explicitly evangelical,
preachy type of poetry.
That's a better way to say it. Yeah. But I just can't do it. I just can't. Now, I don't know if my poetry is any good or not, but I know that the only poetry I can write captures life. It has to be realistic in some way. And I think, because I am a Christian, and Lewis said this very same thing too, talking about Lewis, because I am a Christian, that my faith will come out. I don't have to set out to write Christian poetry for my poetry to actually be Christian.
Right.
I think more Christians need to think about that, the formation of this faith, the way faith and art cohere, and how they are well married. There's a lot of work to be done in thinking about that without artificially or heavy-handedly, imposing faith on art.
Now, back, say, 100, 150 years ago, I mean, Christians were producing some of the best music, right? I mean, we've got Handel's Messiah. Yeah. We've got, just some great hymns of the faith. We were the cultural leaders back then. I mean, maybe it's because it was just a Christian society and that's all that there was. Could you speak a little bit about that and why it is that today, we're not leading the culture, except maybe for a few exceptions? Why is it that we've become more a secular culture?
Yeah, I do think it has to do with commodification and commercialism. I think that the nature of music publishing, music business, I think the nature of literary publishing, art, has sort of forced many Christians into a lane that they probably don't want to be in, shouldn't be in. I think the obvious answer is society as a whole, Western society, was incredibly tolerant of Christianity and was in many ways itself Christian. So there was no question of the church doing anything else but producing those things that would magnify and glorify, Christ and truth and things like that. But I mean, the secularization that's taken place in the West in just the last, 10 years, much less the last 100, is just staggering.
Yeah.
Not only is the faith marginalized and those who adhere to the faith ostracized, stigmatized, and all that, but what Christians produce has now been classified as, inferior in some way or kind of labeled. I mean, just the way music, for example, is I spent a few years as vice president of academics at a Christian music college, and I saw this all the time. I have no musical ability whatsoever, by the way. I just did the academic stuff, but I taught a lot of music students and music business students, and I saw this again and again. You had these students with genuinely brilliant things to say. I mean, incredibly talented. But the way they want to say them, say these things, they want to put these truths across, isn't marketable. K-Love or whatever the station may be, just doesn't play that type of stuff. So if they want to, quote unquote, make it, if they want to be seen, they have to play the type of stuff that's played. That means inherently a compromise. And there's no way I can go from writing a Southern Gothic novel because that's what I want to write. That's what I think I'm called to write. I can't go from that to writing some sort of commercial fiction work without some kind of compromise, some sort of fundamental, I don't know if you want to call it watering down or alteration or something, in my ability to say what I want to say and in the quality of my craft. Right. I think that's what, unfortunately, many Christians are facing today, is they think they have to, they don't have to, but they think they have to play the cultural game of, promotion and commodification now. Art is not art anymore. It's a commodity. It's for purchase. It's commercialized. I think the church needs to get back to creating art for art's sake, because it is inherently, to refer to Tolkien, it's inherently a work of sub-creation. It not only magnifies our God, the great creator, but it brings him honor. I think we need to get back to that. When Dante writes the Divine Comedy, there was certainly a lot of cultural influence, and certainly a lot of there's a lot of social reflection in that. But that is sort of like Milton's Paradise Lost. That's a work of art for art's sake. I mean, it's an exquisite work of art. It's a work of art because the art demands that it be paid attention to, and to quote Madeline L'Engle, it demands to be served. We as Christians should serve the work, because if we believe that God gave us the work, then when we serve the work, we serve God. I just think that's lost today for many Christian artists. So it's no wonder that Christian literature just doesn't. It's just not as good, and Christian music oftentimes just isn't as good. Christian art just isn't as good. Yeah. People are trying to be heard and published, and turning their art into commodity. And I think we have to. I think we need a renaissance. Honestly, I think the way forward is really the way back. Yeah. Wow. Well, this has been great. If you've got a question for Dr. Corey Latta, you can give us a call at 505-2-STRIVE. That's 505-278-7483. Let's continue our discussion after a short break from one of our sponsors.
You're listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
Evangelical Christians are talking about hell. What if we believe what we believe because we've always believed it? What if the gospel is really a matter of life and death? We want you to open your mind, open your Bible, and rethink hell. At rethinkinghell.com, evangelicals look at what the Bible says about hell, putting conventional and controversial views to the test.
Thanks again to our sponsor, Rethinking Hell there. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor of the show, you can go to our website at veracityhill.com/patron. And there, also, if you don't have a business or an organization that you'd like to feature with us, you can become just one of my supporters at what's called the listener levels there at the patron page. So I'm here with Dr. Corey Latta, and today we're discussing cultural horizons, the future of apologetics. But before we get into that, it's time for a segment of the show that we call Rapid Questions. And this is a segment in the show where we ask short, lighthearted questions for us to get to know our guests a little bit more. And Corey, if you could, we want fast responses to these questions. So are you ready?
All right.
All right, here we go.
I'm ready.
What is your clothing store of choice?
Banana Republic.
Banana Republic. What school did you go to?
College or high school?
Pick one.
High school, Munford High School.
Where would you like to live?
Oxford.
What's your most hated sports franchise?
Dallas Cowboys.
Which celebrity are you most like?
Oh, gosh. Clint Eastwood.
If you were a baseball pitch, which one would you be?
Fastball.
Have you ever planked?
I have played.
Taco Bell or KFC?
KFC.
Would you drink a Dr. Pepper if it were handed to you?
No.
What's your inner shake flavor?
Inner shake chocolate.
Chocolate. All right. Well, thank you so much for playing Rapid Questions. That's great. I think that's it's a fun segment that we've just started last week. We'll have to.
I like it.
We'll have to come up with even more creative questions. So thanks again. All right, so we're talking about cultural horizons here, the future of apologetics, and in the first half of the show, we talked a little bit about cultural apologetics, and we focused on literary apologetics too, as a subcategory, if you will. And so then now I've got some questions for you regarding sort of the future of apologetics. So you've mentioned a little bit about how you see it changing. What are some things that you're perceiving in our society today, how, that's sort of changing today?
Yeah, apologetics, I kind of feel like we're maybe in a golden age or entering a golden age in some ways, but the real strength of apologetics, what I think is maybe phase one of this golden age, has been scientific arguments from cosmological evidence, fine-tuning the universe, cosmological argument, the work of people like William Lane Craig.
Yep. Alvin Plantinga,
and others. So epistemology has been big and things like that. The world has changed, though. We are in the most volatile time in history when it comes to the questioning of truth, the nature of truth, and with that, the embodiment of truth, all the way down to our gender.
Right,
These, unfortunately, aren't just scientific questions anymore. So gender fluidity, the idea that I might be born male, but if I so choose, can become female if I feel like my gender is a soul issue or a mental perception, something like that.
Right, it's not just a physical thing,
That's right. So, gender obviously is a biological issue. This is one of these questions today that it sort of astounds me. It seems like Christian and atheists can get hand in hand on this one and say, well, here's the thing. Despite, cultural conversation and social emphasis and things like that, despite what we might want to say about gender biologically and logically, and of course, as supported by Scripture, you either are male or female. This is a pretty obvious biological fact, but it doesn't seem to be the case that even atheists who champion science as their epistemological, fountainhead, as the place from which all truth comes, even they won't chime in and shut this conversation down.
Yeah.
Because it's so unpolitically correct to do so. So we're in this weird place where truth is not just epistemological. It's not just a matter of rationality and obviousness or even scientific evidence. Now truth is a matter of cultural perception and cultural opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's a matter of sentimentality. Now it's a matter of political correctness and political sway. So I think that if we're going to be effective as apologists, look, the quantum cosmological argument's not going anywhere. We need it. We need firm scientific evidence to corroborate our understanding of the gospel and God's working in the world and all that stuff. So I think work will continue to be done in these areas and needs to be done, and that's great. But we've got to become conversant in cultural conversations now. How is truth embodied in the conversation of gender fluidity? When we have a conversation about transgender bathrooms and things like that,
right.
Christians have to be able to speak to these issues intelligently. I think there needs to be more work in the social sciences, probably more work in psychology. I think there needs to be more work in politics, Christianity politics. So much of this has been kind of so many of these conversations have been hijacked by political discourse. That if we want to be relevant, we've got to speak into this stuff. So, where the Democratic Party stands on sexuality matters. It matters a great deal. Where Republicans stand on issues matters. It matters a great deal.
Right.
Christians can't shy away from those things.
Yeah, and it's both parties too. Yeah, right.
That's exactly right. It is both parties. So, I think the future is social in many ways. And this is exactly what we see in the Bible. This is not new terrain to the Christian. I think it has to be reclaimed terrain. Mm-hmm. When Paul, strolls up on Mars Hill and begins to talk about pagan deities and proclaiming the unknown God, of course it was religious, but it was also incredibly social. I mean, the social implications for polytheism were many, and they were prominent. And Paul willingly engaged in these things. And not only did he know the religious systems of the day, but he knew the poetry of the day. Mm-hmm. He knew the authors of the day. He understood issues of sexuality of the day. This is what he gets into in the beginning of Romans. Mm-hmm. We've got to return to this robust, very broad understanding of the human condition to be able to speak to the many, many, many questions of truth.
Yeah. Now, if I may ask you, so you had brought up, a little bit about the transgender debate, and to that you said, well, there's male and there's female. Well, what would you say to someone who said that, well, there are some people that are in between?
Yeah. It's a tough issue, and I think Christians need to be aware of this too, that we can't oversimplify the issue. I think many Christians are guilty of this, unwillingly or unknowingly guilty of this, because we try to champion truths. We might sound, heavy-handed or one-dimensional or dogmatic in that. So we have to understand there are really complex issues between the black and white. But I would say that sexuality is, just like every other aspect of creation, fallen. And that just because something is does not mean it should be. Mm-hmm. So if you have this middle way, if you have this third gender or this crossing between the two, I don't think the question is what is. I think the question is what should be. Psychology corroborates this, supports this. Social sciences support this. Theology certainly supports this. The idea that the most healthy, functioning, thriving context for anyone human is to participate in a heterosexual relationship with another heterosexual, in what's known as the traditional family unit or something like that. If we know that's the way it should be, and if certainly we believe what the scriptures say, and we believe that God's blueprint, his paradigm is true, my conversation with someone who is LGBTQ or transgender or whatever, my conversation isn't necessarily about, it's not totally, I should say, where they are, it's where they should be. And I don't think the conversation is that different from the conversations that I had to be a part of when I wasn't following Christ. When I wasn't following Christ, I took my sexuality in my own hands. I lived the way I wanted to live. Now, I'm heterosexual, so my expression of sexuality was always along heterosexual lines, but it still wasn't in line with what Christ wanted me to, how he wanted me to live. So the conversations that people who discipled me and loved on me had to have with me is, look, it's not a matter of what you want to do or what you think your life should be. It's a matter of where Christ wants you, and if you surrender your sexuality to Him. I think that same line has to be taken in the transgender section. And it doesn't. Here's the thing: it doesn't matter what your sexuality is. Orientation is not nearly as important. It's certainly not talked about in Scripture as much as action is and practice.
Yeah.
Thinking about like Wesley Hill's Washed and Waiting, and that's a great work. And this idea of, okay, your orientation, you may think, is A, B, or C. The question of Scripture is your practice under the lordship of Jesus? That's the ultimate question. Not what you think your sexuality is, and not even how you were born, but is your practice under the lordship of Christ?
Yeah, and that seems to be a lesson that even we Christians need to continually deal with as well. For example, I have in mind here that pornography is, huge right now, even in Christian circles. I mean, a number of pastors still struggle, with that. And
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, really placing our sexuality under the lordship of Christ is huge. And I know another fellow who speaks about that as well, Christopher Yuan, who has had a homosexual orientation himself, but he calls every person, even if you have heterosexual orientation, to place your sexuality under the lordship of Christ. So that's such a good word you've had. Okay, so I do want to follow up though. So with living in a fallen world, there are difficult cases where, it's not just an XY chromosome. And so biologically, some people are born intersex, right? There are, shall we say, abnormalities. And maybe even in the way I phrase that, right? I think, that means there are normalities, which means that there's a rule or a telos. But what if, we just thought, well, it just is. That's just the way it is. So what would you say to someone who thinks, that shows that there aren't just two exclusive genders. There's other ways.
Yeah. Well, it'd be I was trying to think of an analogy as you were talking. It'd be a bit like saying there are a million red balls, and then all of a sudden you find a blue ball. I guess you could approach that two ways. You could say, there are two kinds of balls, two color balls here. We have red and blue, and one is as common as the other, which would seem to me to be false. Or you could say, I do acknowledge that there are two color balls here, but one seems to be the norm and one seems to be the exception to the norm.
Exception, right.
And it seems that logic dictates that we judge the exception by the norm, not the other way around.
Okay, yeah.
So, this may be this is a personal example that I think may serve, because it all has to do with genetics and the physical human condition. So we have 4 kids. We have 2 sets of twins, and my most recent set of twins, they're now 4 months old, a boy and a girl. My boy was born with Down syndrome. This is a chromosomal disease or syndrome, and I think it's statistics are, I can't remember, 1 in 700 or something like that. I can't remember exactly what they are, but I could look at, his name's Gus. I could look at Gus and say, well, he's just another type of humanity in a sense, like his physical condition, his physicality, his health, his chromosomal map or whatever is of this type. And because it should be, or was meant to be, and should be seen as common or as accepted or as patently obvious as someone without Down syndrome. Or I could look at him and say, well, this is even the title, Down syndrome. This is a syndrome. This is an exception to what you and I and the majority of humans, how we live, how we exist, and our physicality and our health and things like that. Just because Down syndrome exists doesn't mean I all of a sudden normalize it and say, well, this is the way it should be. As a Christian, I think that creation is fallen, our physicality is fallen, our very genetic makeup is affected, and that things like cancer, things like heart disease, even things like Down syndrome, while it doesn't change the personhood, this is really important for Christians to remember, it doesn't change the personhood, not one iota. of somebody with Down syndrome.
Right.
It certainly changes how we see the model ideal picture of what the human condition should be. There is no doubt about it. We love our son unconditionally, and it's amazing how much of a blessing he is. But he is not as he should be. It's not normal. It's not prescribed by God. It is a result of the fall. The fall has expressed itself in all kinds of perversions and abnormalities and differences in our physicality. So if I drop dead of a heart attack because I have some sort of genetic heart disease, that's not the way God intended it to be. That's certainly not the scriptural picture. Well, neither is having Down syndrome. Neither is having some sort of chromosomal confusion.
Right.
It's pretty clear if you take Genesis literally that the template, the paradigm for humanity is clearly male, clearly female, heterosexually united,
Right.
and procreating, filling the earth. Anything deviating from that, I don't see there being another option. Anything deviating from that, as Christians, we have to say is a result of the fall.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. It's a complex answer to complex issues, but sometimes that's what's needed.
Really.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So, all right. Let's get back here to. It's great that we were able to get into that specific example. We're looking at and talking about cultural horizons today. So, what do you see as a need for new apologetic thinking?
Yeah. Again, I think social issues, cultural issues are going to have to be addressed. I think we have to be more conversant in that. We have to be more dexterous when it comes to, I need to be able to explain the Kalam cosmological argument, for example. I need to be able to talk about proper basic belief, but also need to be able to speak to sexuality and speak to Christ and politics and things like that. So I think there needs to be more a new nimbleness to our discourse.
So
I also think, though. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, so what would you say, there are different Christian philosophies on sort of how to engage culture, right? So I think Niebuhr's, Christ and culture, the 5 different ways. In our society, is there a need to sort of engage head on? Is there a need to just be subversive and infiltrate? Some people are saying, well, maybe we should retreat at this time. If people viewed us, how they might view other religions, they would let us have our different, sects, our societies, sub-societies. What would you say on those different theories?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I know there's not an answer. There are many answers. You'll talk to one incredibly intelligent Christian who lays out this Essene option, where you kind of hole up and just engage in your own community and things like that, and you'll talk to someone else who says no, plow ahead and run for office and everything. I lean toward engagement, active engagement. I lean toward, I use the word infiltrate. I sort of do see it that way. I think that we need more Christian lawyers, more Christian politicians, more Christian artists, more Christian filmmakers, and I think that Christians who are in professional Christian ministry or called to teaching or pastoring vocations, I think that a large part of their job is to speak into these social issues and these sort of put their foot in these cultural areas. I just don't see how the gospel can be mobilized. I don't see how we're going to be about the business of making disciples. And I don't see how we're going to fulfill Peter's mandate to always be ready to give an answer for the hope that's within us. I don't see how we're going to be able to do any of those things if we're not on the front lines. If we're not fighting these battles for truth. And I think battle is the right word. I think it is a battle. I think that the biblical model in both Old and New Testament, old in the sense that Israel is meant to be a light to the nations, and new in the sense that you constantly see Peter and Paul and others, Peter with the Jews and Paul with the Gentiles, putting themselves before cultural scrutiny, engaging in, Peter's going to Cornelius, in Acts 10 is a great example of this, engaging in cultural issues, the idea of cleanness of food, for example, with people who aren't believers. You see this over and over and over again in the Bible. I just don't know how we can get away from it. So my particular approach, I guess, I teach college, and I'm on staff at a church, but I write and publish creative works that are published in quote unquote secular journals. My own approach is to be very bold, I guess, and to be very unapologetic, and that doesn't mean be unwise, but nor does it mean to not be strategic. But I'm pretty ubiquitous in it. I just sort of am, and I speak about the faith publicly. I speak about the faith publicly in classrooms I teach in.
Right.
I see it as a valid form of discourse. I see it as an undeniable part of history, and I see it as a valid worldview, and I think it should be spoken about as readily as any other worldview. So, my own approach is not that tapered. I'm pretty bare-faced with it, I guess.
Yeah, and would you say that we need to be courageous, unashamed, and yet at the same time winsome, right? And our words need to be sweet to people.
That's right. Yes, absolutely. So, at no point are we bullying or bulldozing or being, dogmatic or pharisaical.
Yeah.
We're called to relationship, and that above all. So, I don't want to just proselytize you. I want to be your friend. I legitimately want to be your friend. You're no mere mortal, to refer to Lewis's weight of glory, and I need to treat you as a mortal.
Mm-hmm.
But in doing so, if you're not a believer, I want you to know Christ the King. I want you to know this great Savior who's done this great work to atone for mine and your sin.
Yeah.
We can't shy away from that,
Yeah, right. Great. Well, hey, this has been, a great opportunity to talk with you to discuss these issues. Thank you so much, Dr. Corey Latta, for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Of course. All right, and so we're coming to a close here today, and it's just really important that we think about how we engage in culture. As we were just talking with Dr. Latta, we need to be winsome, right? We need to be courageous and unashamed, and yet at the same time, we need to be prepared to give it a defense. We shouldn't shy away from these cultural battles, and it's really important that we become the best at our craft. And I think in doing that, we're going to start making good music. We're going to be making good films, great films. We're going to be making good poetry and literature. So it's really important in terms of loving God with everything that we are to do that, to become the best at our craft. And in doing so, that's when we're going to be doing apologetics. We'll be living it out. It's not just a science, it's an art. So that does it for our show today, but let me say next week we're going to be coming to you at the Defenders Media Conference a little bit earlier in the day, in the morning, where I'll be talking about Christian orthodoxy. So the title of the episode is "Help, My Daughter's an Historian. What is Christian orthodoxy?" And so I'll explain that to you then, and we're going to be looking at Vincent of Lorenz. He's one of the fellows that I'm studying about in my graduate work, and there's this rule of faith, and here's the Latin for you: quod ubique, quod semper, quod ab omnibus. And I will discuss what that means and how we can use that to find when and where there are errors in thinking and what ultimately becomes viewed as heretical. So we're really looking forward to doing that, sort of an on-site podcast with you. So that does it for today. I'm grateful for the continued support of our patrons and partnerships with our sponsors, Defenders Media, Consult Kevin, The Sky Floor, and Rethinking Hell. Thank you to our tech team, Chris and Joel, and to our guest today, Dr. Corey Latta. Thank you for listening in and striving for truth on faith, politics, and society.
You've been listening to Veracity Hill, striving for truth on faith, politics, and society. This is a listener-supported program. For more resources, including past shows, visit veracityhill.com.